When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. I could not think of a better way to open today's episode, which will cover the subject of postmodernism. Hello, I'm Jeff Sidarius. Welcome to Later Than You Think. We're going to be talking about that today. It is as I see it, the third leg of the three-legged stool, if you will, upon which the woke movement sits today. We've covered Marxism and neo-Marxism or critical theory in several episodes, and then last time we covered Gnosticism, the second major component, if you will, of the woke movement. And today we're going to cover postmodernism, which is in many ways the most important of the three. It is certainly the one that has had the widest social impact in the Western nations and certainly in the United States. We all live and breathe the air of postmodern ideas, whether we know it or not. And so surveys are consistently showing that most Americans believe that truth is relative, and that assumption has basically filtered down into just about every nook and cranny of our minds. Now, there is a lot to cover today. Before I delve into the substance of what this is, I want to say thank you to all of you out there who are listening to this podcast. We've just recently hit 200 downloads, which to me is absolutely amazing. I've done no formal promotions on this podcast. It's just been a little bit of word of mouth here and there. No advertising, no promotions, nothing. I may set up a Twitter account for the podcast so that folks who choose to respond or engage that way might be able to do it. But thank you to all of you. This has far exceeded my expectations. Before we start, I want to also say one last word about Gnosticism, which was the last episode, and I apologize, it's been a little while since the last episode. I'm going to link in the show notes here in this episode to a New Discourses Bullets that James Lindsay did recently on Gnosticism, which does an incredibly good job of tying up Gnosticism to Marxism on the one hand and to the woke movement of today on the other hand, particularly he shows how it works in the area of the transgender issue, which we talked about in the last episode, and also how it works in the abortion issue. Very timely. It's only about 15 minutes. You do not want to miss it. So in preparing for this this episode about postmodernism, I kind of felt like Mike Rowe, the guy who does the Dirty Jobs TV show. I caught one of his episodes a couple of weeks ago where he was down in the sewers underneath the city of San Francisco. It's one of the world's most beautiful cities, but he was not in the beautiful part. He was down below the street level where the sewers are, and it was like one of the lower circles of Dante's Inferno. I kind of feel a little bit like that in doing the research for these last several episodes, kind of wading through a lot of very bad ideas. They're just, they sound good when you hear them for the first time. They kind of have a surface appeal, but when you dig down into them, and I'm talking about Marxism and neo-Marxism, and I'm also talking about Gnosticism, but particularly here, when you talk about postmodernism, when you scratch the surface, you start digging, they really are appallingly bad ideas, not just a little bit off base, but terribly wrong. But let's take a look at it and see if you agree. What, first of all, is postmodernism? Well, from the name, post means after. Modernism, we've talked a little bit about in previous episodes. It's the general school of thought that prevailed in the Western world, probably, depending on when you want to start it, from 1600s or 1700s up to about the end of the Second World War. And modernism was the idea that, hey, we have the technology, we have human reason, we are making huge technological strides, we can handle all the problems, man can do it. That idea, that school of thought fell upon very hard times after World War II. We had two huge, enormously costly and tragic world wars. It just didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Then things kind of got confused. Secular humanism came along, and that people tried to make do with that for a while. But along about the 1970s, a school of thought called postmodernism started to arise, particularly in France. Academics, three we're going to talk about in particular, in France. But here is one definition given by Jean-Francois Lyotard. I'm sure I'm not saying that right. I'm not a French student, but he's one of the main forces. He said, quote, "I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives." Incredulity means disbelief in meta-narratives. What, you say, is a meta-narrative? Well, a meta-narrative is, according to postmodernists, is a story that claims to give an overarching explanation of events in history or of things in general. You might think of Marxism or Christianity or Islam or something like that. Postmodernists are highly skeptical that these meta-narratives even exist, to the point that they, in truth, deny that any of them are valid. So that's one definition. Wikipedia has a definition that comes from Jacques Derrida, another of the postmodernists, and Wikipedia says, as defined by Derrida, postmodernism is a revolt against the Western idea that there is a being or logos, word, that grounds knowledge, meaning, and language. That's a pretty enormous statement right there. But the definition goes on. At its core, if it has one, deconstruction, that was Derrida's big thing, deconstruction, is an attempt to open a text, whether it's literary, philosophical, religious, or what have you, to several meanings and interpretations. So you get the idea there that texts do not have fixed objective meanings, or at least we can't determine that they do, so they must have multiple meanings. Another commentator named Andrew Sullivan has commented, perhaps a little cynically, but he defined postmodernism as, quote, waking up to the fact that we can't really know anything at all. So those are some definitions of postmodernism. But wait, don't we have to use words in order to define what postmodernism is? Well, I thought postmodernism tells us that words have no fixed or inherent meaning. So how can we even define what it is? I mean, there can't be any objective definition of postmodernism, even if objective reality or if words don't have objective things that they referred to. So this is kind of a problem. If you cannot define something, you have to certainly, at the very least, proceed very cautiously and it probably should put up some red flags in your mind as to whether the thing that is being proposed is really valid or not. Because that is, in fact, what postmodernism claims, that there is no objective truth. Or, to put it a little more precisely, there is no such thing as truth that can be objectively known, much less shared with anybody else. No common or universal, or we would say absolute truth. And why is that? It's because the meaning of words is never fixed, but is always changing. And it's determined, according to these folks, not by reference to any objective reality, but rather by social, cultural, and political constructs. And in the end, according to the postmodernists, particularly Michel Foucault, that means that all language is ultimately about power. That in turn means that all truth is relative. That's where we get relativism, or sometimes it's referred to as pluralism. And yes, I understand those two things are not synonymous, but in turn, what the point is that this philosophy, this way of thinking, reduces all claims about everything, no matter whether we're talking about life, death, truth, heaven, hell, anything. It reduces all those claims to basically the same level as a personal preference. And that's where you get people saying, and I'm sure you've heard this, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. So if you're a Christian person, have you ever shared the gospel with someone and heard them say back to you, that's fine for you, but it's not for me? You probably have. That's because postmodern ideas have, as we said before, seeped into almost every corner of the modern world and into most people's minds. They are there now, they live there almost unquestioned. And the idea that there is no such thing as absolute truth has taken on as near a universally held belief as there can possibly be in our culture today, even, I'm sorry to say, among many professing Christians. So let's run through what that means in real life. Postmodernism rejects all meta-narratives that we just talked about what a meta-narrative is. Now, secondly, it's radically skeptical. Objective knowledge is really, at the end of the day, for the consistent postmodernist, is unattainable, not available. Third, that means there is no absolute truth. All truth claims are merely social constructs of a particular culture, specifically of the powerful in that culture. For example, in America today, it would be white heterosexual males. So, fourth, there is no objective relationship between words and objective meaning. And it's obvious what this means. The implications are very clear. Reason, persuasion, debate are all nonsensical, and really they're beside the point because they don't give us valid evidence. All ideas, thoughts, and worldviews are equally valid. Morality is created. It's not found because there is no objective things or truths out there where it can be found, but it's created through personal choice. And the most important, for our purposes, solution proposed by postmodernism is all power structures, because of this problem that postmodernism sees with language and it being determined by power, truth being to be determined by power, all power structures must be deconstructed, dismantled, and destroyed. Is that beginning to sound familiar to you? You hear a lot of that coming through in the woke movement as it is presented in the media today. There is truth, but only for each individual in his or her own mind. That makes postmodernism radically subjective and individualist. Truth is now, in the postmodern mindset, becomes a politically empowering narrative. So whatever narrative gives you political empowerment, that's truth for your purposes. Now, who are the major players in this? I'm not going to go into a lot of the history here. We've mentioned the three that I want to mention already. Number one, Michel Foucault, who died, just as a footnote, he died of AIDS in 1984. I'm going to provide a link in the show notes to an incident that he was involved in 1977, a petition where there was an issue about the age of consent in France, and he and I believe it was Derrida argued in the petition in favor of lowering the age of consent to 12 or 13. The petition said, quote, French law should acknowledge the right of children and adolescents to have relations with whomever they choose. Perhaps more to the point for our purposes, Foucault is to this day the most widely cited academic researcher in any field. He has over 1 million citations to his written works in the academic world. Amazing. The second is Jacques Derrida, who we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, in more detail. But his big contribution was the idea of deconstruction, which we've mentioned, and then the third one, Jean-Francois Lyotard, which we've also mentioned as well. Now, where do we see this coming up? There are endless examples of this. I'm just going to go through a few of them very briefly. Okay, for those of you who are Christian believers, this one has probably come up if you've ever been to a Bible study. You go to a Bible study and the leader invariably these days will ask, after somebody reads a passage of Scripture, what does that verse mean to you? Okay? And they'll do it without batting an eyelash, without ever thinking about what they're doing. The idea that that verse might have an objective meaning that is clear and understandable just never enters their mind. And it instead of doing the hard work of saying, okay, let's break this down, let's look at the text, let's figure out from the context and from other scriptures, what did that verse mean to the audience to whom it was directed when it was written? And then once we know that or have a pretty good handle on it, then let's figure out how that applies to us today, if it applies at all. Okay, but that's very rarely done. That's an example of how postmodern thinking has influenced people without them even realizing it. Okay, here's another example. This one's a little more close to my world. I'm a retired attorney, and in the late 80s and early 90s, I was involved in the environmental coverage wars. And believe me, they were litigation wars. And they were over coverage for environmental hazardous waste sites in various parts of the country. Without going into the history, which is fascinating, in the early 1980s, the insurance industry introduced a standard form pollution exclusion to their standard business insurance policy, which everyone knows is called a comprehensive general liability policy. All businesses have them. And the exclusion basically said there's no coverage for pollution unless the release, discharge, dispersal, escape, etc. of the pollutant is, quote, sudden and accidental, close quote. So there is coverage. That's what that means, is that there is coverage if the discharge of the pollutant was sudden and accidental. Now, you would think that that would be clear. Well, there are millions and sometimes tens of millions, and in a few cases, even hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. And so lawyers do what they typically do, which is they beat on it until it gives. And so litigation was intense for many years, and even to the point where the two gentlemen who drafted that exclusion were tracked down, and they were put under oath and endlessly, and I do mean endlessly, deposed in case after case after case to determine, what did you mean when you wrote those words? What did you mean by sudden? What did you mean by accidental? And would it be sudden if the release was for 10 days? How about 10 months? How about 8 months? How about 12 months? And on and on and on and on and on, to the point where these poor people were actually harassed almost to the point of, losing their mental health over it. Remember that happened. One of them made a plea in a case that I was involved in, and it was really heartrending. The poor guy had just been harassed to the end of his ability to cope. But in that whole process, one of the arguments that was dragged out by the folks who were trying to get the insurance coverage, trying to get the money from the insurance companies was, well, words like sudden and words like accidental really have no fixed or inherent meaning. So they tried to use the postmodern arguments to try to convince a court that they should be allowed to have insurance coverage. In other words, the word is like silly putty. The word sudden is like silly putty. The word accidental is like silly putty. And you can stretch it to mean just about anything. Well, I'm going to link in the show notes to a California Court of Appeals case called ACL Technologies versus Northbrook Property and Casualty. It was a 1993 case. I was following the case. I wasn't involved in the case, but it had relevance to a number of the cases that I was working on. And it's worth reading because if you look at footnotes 48, 49, and 50, the court basically says, nah, that's a lot of rubbish. We're not going to go with that postmodern interpretation of these words. And they do cite in footnote 49, the court cites to Jacques Derrida, and also cites to the same quote that led off the beginning of this episode in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, the conversation between Alice and Humpty Dumpty, which does come up in the literature, the articles in that field of the law. So anyway, that's another example. Here's another one that you see constantly in the United States Supreme Court cases where you have the originalism concept. It was very similar to what we were talking about in the pollution exclusion context. You have justices like the late Justice Scalia and the current Justice Thomas and others who are arguing that when you try to determine what the Constitution means, what you need to do is go back to when the Constitution was adopted and ratified and look at what the words used meant to the people at that time. That's called originalism. On the other hand, you have justices, many of them, you know who they are, you can figure it out, it's not hard to do, who take the postmodern view and who say, no, the words in the Constitution They're elastic. They can mean what we want them to mean. After all, this is the modern world, and we have moved on from all those old ways of thinking. But just from those examples, I think you can see that postmodernism undermines and ultimately is destructive of all written laws. It not only that, it goes farther, and really the reason it's destructive of written laws is because really at a more basic level, it destroys all ability to communicate meaning. If you take it to its logical endpoint, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be sitting around a fire in a cave, and we're going to be grunting at each other and trying to figure out what each other means, because we won't have any tools to be able to tell what the other person means if words have no objective meaning. Which is why, in my humble opinion, see there I did it again, postmodernism is so very dangerous. Okay, but Jeff, you say this podcast is supposed to be about wokeness. And what does all this have to do with wokeness? Well, let's talk about that. Someone has said, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, that wokeism is applied modernism. Or I would put it this way, I would turn it around a little bit and say that postmodernism, wokeness is postmodernism applied to subvert language, thought, and meaning. Here's how it works. You see or hear these wonderful sounding phrases or sayings that just sound so impossible to disagree with. You know what I'm talking about. Love is love. Words are violence. Trans women are women. Black lives matter. Okay, the examples go on, but here is the process that the woke movement takes. First, you invent an unsupported assertion, one that is difficult or impossible to argue with, and that sounds good on its face. That's step one. Step two, you present that unsupported assertion as an already established fact. And if you see some of the commercials and promotions that are done for these things, that's the way they present them. Step three, you intimidate, punish, and cancel anyone who questions that assertion or disagrees with that assertion. Step four, repeat as needed. So what's going on here? This is what we're seeing played out again and again and again today. It is just one big rhetorical tactic. There is no substance to any of it. All it's designed to do is to get every dissenting opinion silenced. And if they can get you to silence yourself, that's a win for them, because then they don't have to do the work of silencing you. If they can intimidate you into not saying what you believe, not questioning the statement, love is love, trans women are women, because you're afraid of being canceled, well, then they've won. To the postmodernist, and I would say to the woke, truth is simply a function of power. To put it another way, there is no truth, only narratives put out by the powerful. And, lest we forget, the only evidence that counts in the woke is lived experience. Once you cite to lived experience, that's it. Case closed. No more evidence needed. No argument needed. You've established whatever it is you're trying to establish for purposes of postmodern truth. Now, when you step back from this for more than a few seconds and reflect on what's going on here, I think, and I hope and pray that we can all readily see that this is all a bunch of pure nonsense. Now, I'm going to look at why this is all pure nonsense for the Christian believer, but I think and hope that as we go along, those of you who may not be believers can also see why it's nonsense even outside of the Christian framework. Now, let's start with this. If postmodernism is true, then Christianity, and also we could say Judaism, we could say Islam, we could say any number of other faiths, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., are all merely tribal religions. They're true only for those who accept them as true, but not for anyone else, right? That's what postmodernism would claim. All paths lead to the same God. How many times have you heard that? If I had a nickel for each time, I'm telling you, I've heard that so many times, and you probably have as well. But let's just stop and think for a minute. I know that's not considered to be, something we should do these days, but wait a minute. Time out on the field, okay? All paths lead to the same God. That is just intellectual gibberish, okay? It is an insult to any thinking person who is a believer in any one of those religions. I mean, you don't have to spend an hour comparing Christianity with Islam or with Marxism or with Buddhism or any other comprehensive worldview, religious or not even, without seeing that they can't possibly all be true. It's just not even remotely rational at all. It's just silly. And really what it is, it's magical thinking. It's childish, magical thinking. It's thinking to yourself, well, if I don't wish it to be so, then it won't be so. Okay, that just is completely nonsensical. And no one lives their life this way. No one does. Okay? This is just, it's just completely nonsensical. But even so, the polls, and I'm speaking particularly of the Barna polls, which religious people like to look to for questions like this, they are consistently showing that something like 4 to 5 out of 10 Americans actually believe this. It's incredible the extent to which this way of thinking, or I would say not thinking, has penetrated this culture. But just stop for a minute and think about this. If every religion is equally true, which is what postmodernism claims, then the postmodernist has no basis for claiming that the absolute truth claims of Christianity are wrong. Think about it. It is nonsensical, but millions of people, sad to say, have bought into this. And by the way, while we're on this subject, can I just say for a second how arrogant is it to think that no one can ever be wrong about what they believe? Who in their right mind would be arrogant enough to claim that no one can ever be wrong about what they believe? It's completely unthinkable. And then secondly, if postmodernism runs headlong into conflict, and Christian people know where I'm going to go here, of course, it runs headlong into conflict with the words of Christ himself. Jesus' own very clear words. Time and time again, particularly in John's gospel, in John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. That is, for those of you who still study English grammar, the word the, T-H-E, is called the definite article in English. That's its part of speech. And it's being repeated 3 times in that verse for emphasis. The way, the truth, the life. And if that's not good enough for you, you can go to John 18:37, the rather incredible dialogue that occurs between Jesus and Pilate at the trial of Jesus. Jesus says, for this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. So that is very straightforward. Then you have in the high priestly prayer in John 17:17, Jesus saying, sanctify them, that is his apostles and disciples, in the truth. Thy word is truth. So there is such a thing as truth. We know what it is. God establishes what it is. God cannot lie. The Bible says that in many places. And God, through his Son, Jesus Christ, has defined truth for all people at all places in all times. Christianity is not and does not claim to be a tribal religion. Sorry, all you postmodernists out there who keep saying that Christianity is a tribal religion, that claim is false. What you're really saying is you want Christianity to be a tribal religion, but that is most emphatically not what it claims for itself. And to establish that, we need to look no further than Acts chapter 17, where Paul is speaking to the Greeks on the Areopagus, Mars Hill, and he says, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness. That's not a claim of a tribal religion. That is a claim of universal truth, universal righteousness, universal judgment. God, through his Son, Jesus Christ, has told us clearly and exhaustively what it means and what we must do to be saved, which is to repent and believe the gospel. So that's all good as far as it goes, but we haven't gotten to what is by far the most important reason why Christians must reject postmodernism in all of its pieces and parts, and that is that it makes a complete shambles out of any notion of morality. In the words of Ray Comfort, the well-known street evangelist, he said, at the root of relativism is the desire to get rid of moral accountability. Postmodernism completely destroys any objective foundation for morals. In fact, it denies that there can even be one. And this, in fact, creates extreme problems for the postmodernist since he has no basis to condemn any blatantly criminal, immoral, or unethical behavior of any kind. Now, that's not a problem for the Christian. For the Christian, the source of all morality is in the nature and character of God Himself as revealed in His written word, and ultimately through the word of God who was made flesh, Jesus Christ. But postmodernists have extreme difficulty condemning things like sexual abuse of children, Hitler and the Holocaust, Stalin's gulags, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, and all the incredible atrocities and deaths that resulted from it. The list goes on, but you see, if there's no objective truth and no objective standard by which to gauge these things, then there is no basis to say that that was wrong or evil or it should not be repeated. Do you see now how incredibly dangerous this is? Then last but not least, and here we're going to talk about something that's equally true both for Christians and non-Christians. Postmodernism falls apart of its own weight because it is self-refuting. What do we mean by that? That's a term that the philosophers use. Here's an example of what it means. Suppose I were to say on this podcast episode, I do not exist. Well, that's a self-refuting statement because obviously I have to exist in order to be able to make the statement. So it's self-refuting. The same thing is true of the statement that postmodernists want to assert, such as, there is no such thing as absolute truth. In making that statement, they have just asserted an absolute truth, something that is true for all people in all places at all times. They're saying there cannot be such a thing as absolute truth. That is itself an absolute truth statement, a claim of absolute truth. So what does that mean? That means postmodernism at its core is self-refuting. Now, sometime, and that's a serious problem, by the way, it means that really it's garbage and you shouldn't believe it. That's my take on it. But anything that's self-refuting is nonsense and really should not be considered for another 5 seconds. But in any event, here's what happens. Sometimes the postmodernists will respond to that criticism by denying that they take their own claims seriously. But that doesn't really work. That one doesn't fly. They do because when they're criticized, as they frequently are, they respond by defending their papers, by claiming that their statements are true and rational, and doing all the other things that you would expect people to do. So they really undermine their own defense in that regard. So the bottom line here is this, and this is the takeaway, I think, in terms of all the problems with postmodernism. If postmodernists are being consistent, they can never defend themselves against the argument that their position is self-refuting. Think about it. They can't do it. They're not able to defend themselves because the minute they try to defend themselves rationally against the claim that their philosophy is self-refuting, they undermine their own position. Yeah, they do. It's completely and totally ridiculous when you really break it down. So what is the bottom line? Well, for Christian believers facing postmodernism, certainly 2 Timothy 4:4 warns us that in the last days, which is all the days since Jesus ascended until now, and continuing on until his second coming, it says, men will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. So we have been warned. And Paul also in 1 Timothy warns us against, quote, the opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed and thus gone astray from the faith. And I'm afraid that would include many folks who've been taken in by postmodernism. That is 1 Timothy 6, verses 20 through 21. Matt Roberts, who is a British Presbyterian pastor who I follow and who has been doing battle with the issues on homosexuality and women in ministry and so forth in the Church of England, has a good quote on this, a tweet that I want to read to you. He says, quote, we often forget that believing in the existence of truth and reality owes a huge debt to Christianity. Reality is founded in God's creation, and truth has been revealed in Christ. If we, not God, determine what reality and truth are, the end point is a morass of gibberish. And he references a tweet involving the Scottish government and the claim that all trans women are women. I'm going to leave you the last word, which I came across in the research for this episode. I don't have an attribution on this, but it's a professor, so I'm going to assume it's a college professor. He said this about postmodernism. When someone says there is no such thing as truth, they are asking you to believe them. So don't. I think that about sums it up. That's where we will leave it for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or want to engage with me, please email me at diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. That's diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. Tell me what you think. If you think I've gotten it wrong, been unfair, or left something out, or said something I shouldn't have said, let's talk about it. Next time, we will talk about how postmodernism and Gnosticism and neo-Marxism, as they have combined to create and support the woke movement, what we have today, how that is playing out in our public discourse. We'll look at some examples of it, and we'll see how it applies, how we can recognize it, how we can resist it, how we can respond, and ultimately how we can rebuild. Thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Jeff Sidarius. Please remember that the hour is late, and indeed later than you or I or any of us think.